This is Running Remote Online, the final session of this August event. Amazing news. We will be back this fall, though, with another edition of Running Remote Online, tentatively scheduled for November. We also have information coming on the community that we are launching, the online community we are launching for remote workers. Everyone in attendance at this conference will be invited for free access. I could not be more excited about this panel. The topic, large enterprises, the reality of remote work. One of the, if not the absolute leaders when it comes to remote work in large enterprises. She's the CEO at Virtual Work Insider. Her name is Sacha Connor. She's a friend and colleague, and we are I'm a remote work nerd. I am excited for this panel, to say the least. Sacha, good afternoon. I hear there's a pending storm in your area. These are the perils of remote work, but we're so excited to have you guys. I'm going to get out of the way and listen in.
Thanks, Danny. Yes, we have a backup plan in case the storm hits and I lose power. So we're going to have the panelists join us. I am so excited to be part of today's event and get to introduce all of you to some of my clients and my friends as we do something pretty unique for running remote. So we're going to talk about the role of remote work at large, non-tech, non-SaaS enterprises. So as we are talking, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. I'll be asking the group some pre-prepared questions first, and then we'll leave time at the end to answer your upvoted questions. So as Danny said, I'm Sacha Connor, the founder and CEO of Virtual Work Insider. My company teaches distributed, hybrid, and virtual teams on how to lead, communicate, and collaborate across distance. But before starting my company, I worked at a large enterprise. I was a marketing leader for the $6 billion Clorox company for 14 years. And 8 of those years, I led my teams while working fully remotely. So let's introduce the panel now. So on the panel, we have my longtime friend and colleague, Kira Zerl. So Kira has been a marketing and business leader for over 19 years at Clorox. Kira and I were actually remote work pioneers for the company when we went remote back in around 2010. So she has a ton to share with you about her experience as a pioneer in a large enterprise like Clorox. We also have Eric Schuetzler. Eric is also a Clorox alum. We worked together about 10 years ago when we were leading new product innovation teams. But now he is the Global Vice President of Research and Development for Beam Suntory, which makes products like Jim Beam Bourbon and Hornitas Tequila. You might see in the background, I have some props here to bring some of the products to life. And we had just finished a virtual leadership training skills series with his team when COVID hit. And then we also have Marty Kaplan. So Marty is not a Clorox alum, so I wouldn't go asking her about cleaning or disinfecting advice, but you can ask her questions about maybe cars and financing, since she is the training and development manager for the sales organization within Toyota Financial Services. We have been working together for almost a year now to help support her sales teams as they were transitioning to fully remote work. So now I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. I'm going to ask them to give you a little bit more context on the work that they do right now and set the stage for all of you that are listening in terms of how much remote work was happening before COVID at these large enterprises and how much remote work is happening right now because of COVID. Then we'll get into some questions about some of the challenges and successes that they've seen during the transition. And then we're going to get into what do they think that the future holds. All right, just a reminder again, you can pop those questions into the Q&A box. So let's start with Marty. Can you tell us a little bit more context about what was happening before COVID and what's happening right now in terms of how you're using remote work?
Sure, absolutely. So prior to COVID, Toyota Financial Services was in the midst of a large field sales reorganization. So to set the context a little bit, we have our headquarters location in Plano, Texas. We have 3 customer service centers in Arizona, Iowa, and Maryland. And we had 29 field sales offices, dealer sales and service offices located around the country. Those offices were kind of divided into two main functions, being kind of the operations side of the business and the sales side of the business, both in support of our dealer partners, Toyota and Lexus dealer partners. We were in the middle of a field reorganization that began about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, where we are closing the 29 sales offices and consolidating them into 3 dealer service centers in Arizona, Plano, Texas, and Atlanta. And the sales teams from those offices were transitioning to work fully remotely. So prior to COVID, we did have a pocket of about 250 people in the organization who were just beginning this transition to remote work. Excuse me, it began in December, January. I was one of the people who was transitioning into a remote role and supporting the sales organization in terms of training. So we had engaged Sacha at that point to help support our leaders specifically as it related to virtual leadership skills.
Yeah, so Marty's team had a little bit of a head start in that they had already started planning to go remote even before COVID, but they weren't fully all the way there, ready to do that. And this kind of forced everything to transition super fast. And we're going to talk in a little bit about some of the struggles and successes that they had during that. So let's move on to Eric. Can you give us a little bit of context about your organization?
Yeah, so my organization, being Suntory, we're about 4,800 employees globally. So we're a highly distributed team, but we were not in very many remote working situations in my organization in R&D or in the broader organization. We're an organization that, our products usually are consumed when people are together, and bringing people together is part of the culture. So it really wasn't part of the culture to all work in a different place. So serendipitously, I looked like a little bit of a crystal ball reader by getting Sacha's, into my team and bringing us up to speed on how to work better together in a distributed way, so not fully remote. We finished all that up and then COVID hit. So we have gone fairly remote as a broader organization. However, within my organization as an R&D group, you can't really make R&D, products and new samples and research in your home. So we have had to do a lot of hybrid approach where we have people in the office with all the right, COVID safety approaches, but really leveraging a lot of the techniques we sort of learned and became used to as a group, because while many of us are home full time, we have a bunch of the group that's in. So coming up with the rules of the road, are we video first? Are we all in rooms? Are we separate no matter where we are? So that's been a real key thing to figure out as we've gone through this, especially when you start to bring in the rest of the organization around the world who all have their own local challenges that they're dealing with in terms of COVID or remote.
Right. So what I love about this panel and what you're going to hear is this wide variety. So what Eric just said, they were not remote at all, right? The work we were doing was helping the office sites work better together, but not about working fully remotely. So this was a huge change for them. And the fact that they were in product development where they needed to even have some people still go in physically into an office. So let's round it out with Kira. So let's talk a little bit about the Clorox company.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so Clorox, we have 8,800 employees around the world, and we're located out of Oakland, California, so that's where our headquarters are. And we have a real large technical center in Pleasanton, California, but we also had offices around the United States, and we have offices obviously around the country or the world. As I think about how we were structured prior to COVID, I would say that we were heavily co-located in those main sites. We did have some employees in satellite sites, and then we had some employees working remotely. But I would say we were primarily co-located teams, employees, and we had some distributed members as well. We also worked cross-functionally, and so we have our manufacturing sites out on the East Coast, and we had some teams up in Canada, Chicago. So what we would find is we would have project teams that were actually working remotely together. And so in our world, the Clorox company, our technology teams, they had done a great job of building in Microsoft Teams, WebEx, some of those platforms that we can use to help bridge our employees together. But in best practices, we were primarily trying to co-locate together. I happen to be unique in that I have been remote since 2010. So in my world, no matter who I was working with, I was remote. But for us, again, it's the connection that we had. When COVID hit, we were 100% remote. Similar to Eric, though, we do, obviously, Clorox company, we have to create and make our disinfecting products. We also have other products that are in high demand as people were sheltering in place. So a lot of our manufacturing employees still had to go to manufacturing sites. Our R&D employees still had to go in the lab and make sure we could, manufacture and make the products that will help keep everyone healthy and safe. So similar to Eric, with those two, they were going in, we had very rigid schedules, safety checks, PPE, and making sure that we were following all of the right protocols. For everybody else, remote, 100%. And the challenge and the opportunity that we had, really, everyone had primarily been familiar with the technology, but they weren't used to using it 100% of the time. And so I would say, Sacha, like ways of working and really embracing that fully remote environment has been a large learning curve for the majority of our employees.
And I think, so as Kira was saying, it was a largely co-located organization, but is it true, if I'm remembering correctly, it was maybe like 15% maybe were fully remote for the company before COVID, right? And so a huge change again for them to go so drastically using remote work. So let's talk a little bit more about that transition. So I'm going to go back to Eric. So as Eric mentioned, that needing to physically manufacture those products, it's a very hands-on role in some cases. And, this transition from not working fully remotely to working remotely. So can you tell us maybe some stories about how you were keeping your teams communicating, collaborating effectively, or maybe not so effectively, if there's anything that the group can learn about your trials and errors during this transition?
Yeah, so, we had the same challenges that Kira was just saying, right? Our manufacturing sites are going in, R&D is going in, because apparently when you can't find Clorox wipes, you buy a bottle of Jim Beam. So we're seeing a lot of demand as well. So, what we experienced is, first of all, a big, huge technology, learning curve. I think that Kira started to mention is like, there's a technology learning curve, there's a ways of working learning curve. And at being a company that wasn't very remote, there wasn't much respect for the experience of someone who's not co-located at a site. Well, now everyone has this experience. So there's people that were learning, Skype or Teams or Zoom in the moment. So just getting over that first hurdle was a big one. And very candidly, as a larger organization, we've struggled a bit with which platform to use. We were on Skype, we're migrating to Teams, and then certain people, created their own Zoom accounts on the side, and IT doesn't like that. So you have a lot of challenge there on what's the platform and what features does it have. So we really had to overcome that. But I would say the biggest challenge we've had to overcome is when you're doing this hybrid approach, especially with COVID, is actually breaking down the normal things that all of us have been taught around being nice and being around each other, right? And being congenial in a shared work environment where you're trying to drive distance between people for their own safety. The natural tendency has been when they go back to the offices and they're working, if we have a meeting, the natural tendency is to want to be around other people. So really being clear with what are our rules of the road in terms of our remote principles. So if we have a meeting, everyone should go back to their own desks, or if the desks are too close, we have different rooms people could go to individually, so that we're not only keeping people safe, but what we've also learned is that if you get everyone remote and you don't have a group of co-location and then some remote, everyone gets the same experience. So, whether that's a good experience or bad experience, everyone gets the same one. And that hasn't been the case. Feedback in the past, as Sacha, has been, well, if you're with the Chicago group, they always dominate the conversation and you can't get a word in, or the Kentucky group, they dominate the conversation. So it's really been beautiful to actually see that come to life on a regular basis now, of really respecting the experience someone else is having in their own, remote space.
Right. I think what you're getting to is this incredible empathy exercise that we all now have for each other. Kira and I from 2010, working all those years fully remote and feeling all that distance bias happening. Right now, what's happening is everybody's getting a sense of that in a way. And so when we go back to whatever the next normal is, people will have appreciation for that. The other thing that I love about what you said, Eric, was these new norms that you're setting up. So if you think about the work that we were doing before COVID, and you had people in office sites, the tendency was to gather in those conference rooms, dial into the different conference rooms, and maybe you had a couple of people in a different location. And even within our training, we decided to have everybody do it from their own desk, which was kind of funny because some of you were kind of all in a bullpen together, you could see each other in the backgrounds. But that's now become the norm. And as you said, out of safety for each other, but also it is a good principle to have in terms of location inclusion and overcoming that distance bias. So Marty, let's go to you next. So we talked about how you're supporting the Toyota Financial Services sales organization. And from the assessment work that we did, we saw that it was a really hard transition for the field sales team to overnight go from in-person sales. So they were actually used to going into dealerships on a daily or weekly basis, working with the dealers, to completely virtual sales. And so a lot of companies are struggling in the sales organization on how to move to virtual sales. So can you tell the group a little bit about how that transition is going and what your group is doing to help support the sales force during that transition?
Sure, absolutely. So like Sacha said, we have a pretty tenured sales organization. A lot of people across the sales organization have been with the company for 25 plus years. And they have been used to working in person. And the assessment work that we did, we actually had many people say, this transition to COVID working from home has rendered me ineffective. I mean, those words were used to say, I cannot do my job without being able to be in person with dealers. So this was a really big transition. It was also, you know, funny enough, these people were transitioning to working from home, and that was a hard transition too, but they were already mobile workers. They were on the road a lot, so they weren't together often as a team, but they still found their together time in the office to be extremely valuable. So I think there were two conflicts happening here and two big challenges with this working together as a team and the leadership components, as well as that partnership with their dealers. So as we have been rolling out training with Sacha, we have been doing training specifically for our frontline leaders, those who lead the sales teams. And these people are in new roles in a lot of cases due to this field reorganization. So we are happy that we had started this training work with Sacha prior to the transition, because we had already started to establish some of those principles and norms up front. So some of those things like video first culture, which I know that Eric mentioned, you know, we had started to socialize that idea with some resistance at the beginning of COVID and some significant challenges with the Skype platform. We had a lot of issues with it. And so if people weren't using it internally, then it was unlikely that they were going to feel comfortable trying to use it with their dealers. So when we transitioned to Teams instead of Skype, we did find that people started to adopt the video usage more, and that they were starting to embrace it within their teams. And as leaders encouraged it and modeled it, it became even more comfortable and people became more open to using it. And now we're even hearing people say that with their dealers that they are finding themselves to be even more productive and more effective than they were before. Some people have said that they feel even more connected to their teams internally. And in a lot of instances, these people are located in one city, say Chicago, but their dealers are located throughout the states of Illinois and Indiana. So they're not necessarily close by. So they might be driving 6 or 8 hours once a month because we want to have this in-person time with our dealers. I heard a sales manager say last week that he can now have 3 or 4 meetings in a day which used to take one of those meetings would take 2 days in the past because of the need to go in to the store. They're also finding that the relationships with the decision makers in the dealerships can be even more effective because of the time that they can just grab, hey, let's just grab 30 minutes on a quick video call rather than being forced to come into your store and go out for lunch and all of the other details that may go along with a sales call. So we are finding some resistance still, but for the most part, we've gotten a lot of people to embrace some of these concepts across sales.
Yeah, what is, I think, incredible about this, and something that, you know, sales organizations across industries should be thinking about, is if you learn to get this right, if you learn how to, you know, what I teach about is how to influence across distance and how to continually influence, not just wait for those in-person moments to influence and to sell. This is going to be a game changer. This is going to be the way in the future that you should continue to sell. As Marty was saying, right? During some of our discussions with the salesforce, you can hear the light bulbs going off in terms of, yes, I'm going to keep doing these certain ways of working activities with my dealers, with the customers, ongoing, even after I can get back into the dealerships in person with them. So it's a huge learning curve for everyone now, but will only help in the future. And the other thing I'm going to just stop and talk about for a minute before we get to Kira is, because Marty brought this up and Eric brought this up, is back to this video first culture and this learning curve. So, you know, these, believe it or not, for most of you listening, you know, these organizations, these large companies, some of them were not using even video conferencing before COVID. And so there is a huge learning curve on some of even the most basic technology tools for these organizations. And it's a struggle, and it's a struggle to get them to, with video, to know what buttons to press, for example, to know where the camera is sometimes, and also to feel comfortable on video, right? So there's that piece of it as well. And so many of you who are listening right now might have some questions around, like, what are the tech stacks that these companies are using to work in these virtual teams? Well, we're pretty foundational and just doing the fundamentals right now. So video, figuring that out, maybe starting to understand how to use Microsoft Teams. So using Microsoft Teams for video and maybe for instant messaging, but haven't yet gotten to using the persistent chat and the threads and the channels, which a lot of people listening to us for running remote are probably really well-versed in Slack, for example. So these are new tools that are a huge learning curve for these orgs. So I don't know whether Eric or Marty, you want to chime in on either of that in terms of your experience.
I guess I'll kick in first and say you couldn't be more right. Right. I mean, the learning curve is strong, and for people who are been working remote for years and years, and who this is the day in, day out, right? It was not seen as a tool that was a massive benefit, and it's not the core product of our business either. So it was just not something that anyone put any time or effort behind. Now that's shifted drastically. Last 6 months, IT has completely shifted. The progress on our video and platform capabilities has gone up exponentially in that 6 month time, but we're still probably well behind the bleeding edge.
Yeah, and I'll agree that it was definitely a challenge. And I worked a lot. I report to headquarters, and so worked a lot with headquarters, even though I was working remotely. And our phone calls would be done using Skype, but using a call-in number, and everyone would call in on their phones. Maybe, they'd be able to see the screen share a lot of the time, but I can't even say 100% of the time. And video was a huge challenge. So we tried early on to really get that video to be prominent, but it took a long time to have leaders and team members feel comfortable with it. But we are really making big strides, like Eric said, in terms of our technology. We have transitioned to Teams. I personally am actually transitioning into a new role in a different team within headquarters, which I can talk about in a little bit. But with that, I'm seeing that team is really using the chat, or beyond the chat, the channels and the file storage and everything like that within Teams, and I can see how much more productive it can make us rather than relying on SharePoint and OneDrive and email and all the different connections. So I'm excited to start seeing that, and I hope that we can continue to grow that capability throughout the organization.
All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Now we're going to go back to Kira. So as Kira said, Clorox found itself having to transition to this fully remote work really quickly, and at the same time couldn't skip a beat with productivity because there's such a high demand for Clorox disinfecting wipes and bleach and some of the other products that it produces. So again, to change gears a little bit, can you tell the group about the Virtual Workforce Employee Resource Group, so ERG? So many people on the call might not even know what an ERG is. This ERG that we co-founded back in 2012, obviously not knowing that a pandemic was coming our way years later, but how and if that might have helped create a competitive advantage for the company during this transition, and should companies think about creating something similar to this group?
Yeah, Sasha, we were definitely ahead of the curve when we started our effort in our employee resource group. So at Clorox, we have several employee resource groups. It can go from protected categories to things like virtual employees. And so we founded one, and the mission was really to make sure that Clorox employees and teams can thrive wherever they work or live. And, before COVID, and we founded our resource group, it was critical that we partnered with our HR department, critical that we partnered with our IT department, because as both Marty and Eric have mentioned, there is a learning curve. And, this employee resource group, what it created for our employees and our teams was a platform for learning, right? So there is a learning curve when you start working remotely. And quite frankly, our resource group was valuable for anyone who worked with a screen. If you think about it, right, even if you're on the 12th floor and the 13th floor, if you're working with the screen, it's a different skill set than when you're in the room together. So, for us, it was, how do you lead influentially from a virtual place? Like, what are the soft skills you need? What are the personal skills you need? So we were able to build a lot of those tips and tricks prior to COVID. And we were one of the largest employee resource groups at Clorox, I think over 700 members around the world, because there was such a demand. Whether you're co-located, whether you're distributed, whether you're fully remote. COVID hits, and all of a sudden, it was a change for everyone's world. Prior to COVID, the Clorox company, we have a new strategy, and part of that is changing the way we work. And it really was making sure we were designed to work efficiently and designed to drive growth. As part of that, sounds like we're a Microsoft Teams commercial, not planted, but Clorox was also moving to the Microsoft Teams platform. And, and I think the COVID impact made us take this even faster. But the role that our employee resource group had in this transition is that the leaders were able to step up and share tips and tricks right away. Because it's not just about the professional side, but there was the emotional side, there was the personal side, and there was the social side. Right? So what ergonomics do you need? How do you make sure you're not going to have any employee, health issues, right? Whether it's your wrists or whatever the case may be, fatigue, exhaustion. We are also able to give tips and tricks on how do you keep social engagement. It was a global pandemic. And for those who are not used to working remotely, you get exhausted. You don't realize that you might be sitting all day long. So how do you need to build in those breaks? How do you build in the time for water and food? How do you build in the time to socialize? Because for those who are used to being co-located, you could walk down a hall and see people. You could walk in a cube and say hi. So our employee resource group had already built in some of these tools and trainings for our employees, and we were able to send those tips and tricks out on a weekly basis. I mean, obviously, it was a higher order of level of importance for our HR department, for our IT department, for our executive committee. But Sasha, I think to be ahead of the curve and build in that type of content for our employees was very critical. So even today, we still have our resource group is still partnering with HR to make sure we have the right virtual learning out there. The one just came out today around influencing, across the screen, presenting powerfully. And, there are different ways and skills that you need in a virtual environment than perhaps, that get elevated in a virtual environment versus what you might see in a co-located environment.
Yeah, and to build on that, for anybody who's thinking about, should you create a group like this? If you're a larger sized company, I think it's a great way to rally together your experts, your internal experts on remote work. So we had some people who were on the expert end of things that were running the ERG to then be able to provide these tips and tricks to the people that were more novice. And as Kira was saying too, to be able to bring that virtual location inclusion lens to everything the organization was doing. We were kind of the squeaky wheel that would be like, that is not location inclusive. How do we actually make sure that everybody feels like Kira was saying, that they're being able to thrive no matter where they live or work, that we're not too headquarters focused, for example. So you kind of need somebody who's continuing to beat that drum ongoing. And this is actually a perfect segue into the last section in terms of thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And then we'll get to some of the questions that I see through SwapCard. So when it comes to the future, so thinking about how do you prepare yourself for having those people who are going to help continue whatever it is into the next normal, to continue under diversity and inclusion, even to think about that location inclusion, that belonging. Many companies have started to create roles like head of remote. I actually think it should be a head of hybrid role, because I think most large organizations are not going to go to completely fully remote for the whole organization, but it will be much more hybrid than it was in the past. So you need somebody who is keeping an eye to how is this hybrid organization going to run. So speaking of the future, let's just talk a little bit about kind of what is next for your organization based on what's happening with COVID right now and the changes that the disruption that we've seen. How is that going to impact what the future looks like? And I'm going to go to Marty, because as she mentioned, she's changing roles, which is very much integrated into this question of where do we head next?
Sure. So we have a department that is called Enterprise Transformation. This was the department that was responsible for leading us through the recent reorganization. A few years ago, our headquarters also relocated from Southern California to Plano, Texas. So this group has done a lot of large scale change throughout the organization. And the current initiative that this group is focusing on is called Remote Work Enablement. Our CEO is really passionate about this and announced during our what used to be an in-person all-employee meeting that happened over a series of videos this year. The last video, he announced that this team was being created to focus on remote work enablement. This initiative, Remote Work Enablement, is kind of structured into multiple work streams. One of which is readiness and segmentation. So which parts of our organization are ready, and how are we ready to work in a more hybrid way or a more remote way on a permanent basis. A lot of focus on adaptive workspace and on real estate and facilities and the workplace considerations specifically. And then one that's focused on remote work policies, principles, and norms. So a lot of the work that we have done with Sacha and kind of how do we standardize a lot of those people processes, like recruiting and performance management and onboarding and training and development. So I'm excited that a new role was posted within this team, and I'm going to be joining the team responsible for communications and change management across those different work streams. So as we know, with any large scale change, communications and change management is critical to its success. So I'm a little bit nervous, very excited, sad to be leaving the sales world, but excited to take what we've done with that group and hopefully kind of make that effective and more broadly positioned across the organization.
Yeah, and what I love about that story is it's almost like the sales organization within Toyota Financial Services was kind of a pilot. And yes, COVID hit, and so it made everybody have to kind of change their ways. But then looking more broadly at total Toyota Financial Services, and then maybe even further into Toyota North America, right? So it starts as a seed. You learn and prove it out and pilot and experiment, and then it can grow from there. Eric, just within like a minute, maybe, like anything that you're seeing in terms of how the total Beam Suntory Enterprise might change in terms of ways of working, future of work?
I mean, real quickly, we're starting a similar type initiative called Future of Work, right? So thinking beyond COVID. So there's a work stream put together, not quite as organized maybe as an ERG, but more of a kind of a project management situation going on. So that's good. We're thinking about what it's going to be like for the long term. So I would say the big challenges here are we're probably not ever going to go to fully remote, right? So we are going to have to deal in a hybrid model. So when you think about that, that's going to be really figuring out what roles are more suited for remote, and you might have bespoke policies or procedures that deal with different areas of the group. An R&D organization, a manufacturing organization, very difficult to go fully remote. But if you're a project manager, managing projects all over the world, is location as important? So those are the things we have to work through as an organization and figure out what the policies and procedures are going to be to make sure that we still keep engagement high and we get the work done and everyone's feeling really good about it.
How about you, Kira? What are you seeing at Clorox?
I think very similar to Eric, will likely remain a hybrid organization. You know, I think again, our manufacturing folks required to go in, R&D, you know, core to that. I think as we look at our other businesses, it will likely be a case-by-case basis. And, you know, I think there is still value in folks coming together, right? And sharing ideas and working together. So I think, you know, where Clorox is right now, you know, we're reevaluating, looking at what the landscape will be, looking at, you know, what lessons have we learned from this? What is working well? How do we take that into the future? And then what are some of those opportunities that we've lost from this structure? But I think it will be probably business by business, but I would likely bet absolutely more of a hybrid than we were in the past.
All right. Well, we are going to go to the Q&A right now. So I see Miranda Helmer. Hi, Miranda. Your question. So what advice do you have on keeping the new things we learned as a company without backsliding into old ways after the pandemic? So how do we make this sustainable? Does anybody want to, you can raise your hand if you want to take this first. How do we make this sustainable?
Go ahead, Eric.
My thought around keeping, well, first of all, hello, Miranda. So my thought about keeping it sustainable is we're going to have to keep reminding folks that what it was like when we were all remote, right? And I think now the empathy, as Sacha mentioned before, the empathy is much higher than it ever was before. And my view of it is when we go to this hybrid world, I don't think we're going to be back in a place where it's 5 days a week, everybody's in the office, because even if you say, okay, 2 days a week you can be somewhere else, those 2 days are never going to line up. So you're always going to have somebody who's not there. So I think it's going to have to be top of mind, and we're going to just have to keep reinforcing the principles because like with most things, memories get short and you'll go back to just, you know, high-fiving each other in the office. But we really need to make sure that we're remembering what it's been like over these last 6 months.
And I would just add, I agree, Eric. And I think for me, Miranda, as I think about how do you take forward what's working well, I think it's making sure that we are taking moments to actually debrief what is that. You know, I think everyone's, at least with us, we've been so focused on execution and making sure we can, you know, supply and provide what our consumers and customers need and community. But I think it will be important that at some point we have a moment where we reflect back on what are the key skills, what are the key elements that are working, and then we need to build it into our protocols and our policies and our practices. You know, I think probably every organization has a training arm, and if not, you bring in a training arm. So how do we fold that into the training classes that we have? How do we fold it into the onboarding? That's the other part that I think we can be extremely influential, right? So whoever we're recruiting now, you know, they're going to be used to this digital virtual world. And I think as we look at our onboarding practices, it'll be critical there as well. So Miranda, I would say institutionalize what's working well into some of those practices and policies.
And actually to build on that, you just brought up the onboarding. So there was a question for Mariana. Hi, Mariana, about how are you maintaining your culture in a virtual environment, especially integrating new hires virtually, right? So how are they getting to know the culture of the team and how to work with a new manager remotely? Does anybody want to take that first?
I will. So we in addition to this recent field sales reorganization and closing those offices, we also created a new business with Mazda Financial Services as a private label. And that meant that there are a lot of new sales team members remotely and being onboarded fully remotely. There was one touch point of getting the entire field sales organization for Mazda Financial Services together in late February, right under the time. But other than that, everyone has been doing it remotely. And I think it's a lot of planning in terms of what needs to occur at different points in time. So kind of segmenting the functions that they need to know into bite-sized chunks so that they're able to digest pieces throughout their onboarding and not be drinking from a fire hose. And also to put a lot of the onus on the leader and the manager to provide a platform that allows this person to learn the organization, to grasp pieces, to ask a lot of questions, to make it comfortable to speak up, to have this open door policy through Zoom, or kind of knocking on their door through a chat. So just making sure that people understand the best ways to communicate is really critical. And video. I mean, I can't say enough about the connection that can take place through that personal feeling that you get through talking to each other on video.
Sacha, the only other build I'd have is on Marty's, is on the culture part of that question is, we've created ways that we just do fun things in these remote worlds to try to learn the culture and the way that the teams interact. That's beyond just how do we do our job, which obviously is the core, but a lot of this other stuff around how do we build the culture. We've had virtual wedding showers, virtual baby showers. We've had a lot of stuff over the last 6 months that we never would have done remote. It would have been, in your own location, and then maybe some thank you or congrats emails. And I think that's been a way that some of the newer team members can feel more part of the team than you would through any other just normal business interaction.
Great. So I love the activity, creativity there with making everybody feel really inclusive across locations again. And I think it's also about kind of reinforcing what the team values are, what the company values are, and that's in how you reward people, that's in how you recognize people, that's how you reinforce the values as well. So that there's the fun piece of it, but then there's also the foundational kind of value piece of the organization that you have to help these new people understand as they come in. So I'm going to go to a different kind of question. So this is from Dimitri, which he says, how open are big companies to working with freelancers? So I think we have a lot of people who are freelancers who are listening and are running remote today. And one of the challenges that has been with freelancers is oftentimes they are remote. You hire them in remotely. And large organizations, again, have usually been under the auspice of, if I'm going to hire you any business as a freelancer, I need you to come into a building. So has that changed at all? Are you using freelancers in a different way and remote freelancers?
I will speak first. I would say I don't think Clorox has changed the way that we're working with freelancers. I think, we have our established teams, then every business, we might need to bring in contractors to fill in either maternity leaves or other gaps. And I think in the COVID world too, I think even with home care of school of kids and so forth is changing that a little bit. But I don't think our engagement with freelancers has changed. I can't speak for all large companies, but there's always the ebb and flow of business. And so sometimes you need a critical skill that for some reason there's a gap in your talent base. And so I think for us, COVID hasn't changed that. I would say that it is one where it's still a case by case basis and business need as necessary.
Ditto.
Same here.
All right, so to wrap this up, I see Liam is asking, what do you think is the biggest challenge for enterprise to overcome when thinking about remote work? So I'll give each of you the opportunity to say what one biggest challenge.
We've got about a minute left though.
Oh, okay.
We've got a minute left.
We have only 1 minute left.
Can you tell us the biggest challenge in like 10 seconds?
Let's try rapid fire. Who could go first?
Marty, go.
Can't unmute myself. The biggest challenge, I really can't think of one. Can someone else go?
Unmuting yourself properly, Eric.
Unmuting myself.
So, I would say the perception that the same amount of work is getting done as it would be if you were in the office.
Boy, this event's almost over. That maker's mark looks amazing. Kira.
I would say way of working. I think we need to continue to reimagine how we're working. Old ways aren't the current ways, so just keep challenging yourself on what can change.
Marty, it's your moment.
Now they took them. I think it's communication. I think it's making sure that culture stays true and continues to evolve. I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. Sasha, what a panel. We got to close this out, but that was amazing. Thanks for the insights, Sasha.
Thank you, everyone.
Wow. Sorry for the abrupt close. We wanted to get as much content in as we possibly could. Thanks to you guys. We will be back in just a few minutes. Liam Martin, the newest father on earth, not the newest father on earth, but we're going to talk about family life and remote work, and we will talk about this third edition of Running Remote Online momentarily. Thanks again to all of you, and thanks to Sacha for putting all this together. Cheers, guys.